Welcome to another module of Collection Management, Building Your Collection, a State of Iowa Director's Course for the State Library Endorsement Program. My name is Becky Heil, and I am the Southeast District Consultant and a member of the Continuing Education team for the State Library. According to the Library Director's Handbook, collection management is an important library function and involves three major aspects: developing policies for the collection, budgeting for the collection, and developing strategies for building, weeding, and maintaining your collection. In this first module, Building Your Collection, we will talk about creating a good policy, the importance of a balanced collection, and a look at the life cycle of library materials. In the other modules in this course, we will look at maintaining your collection, cataloging materials, and the final step of weeding a library collection. After staff, the library's collection is its next major asset. A good librarian should be able to answer basic questions about their collection, like size, turnover rate, or circulation. We should also know how satisfied our patrons are with the collection, but much of our evaluation of the collection will be based on use. Collection development is at the heart of what libraries do. It is in being able to meet the needs of individuals with the right stuff that we fulfill our missions. For some people, the right stuff will be the technology we make available, while for others, it will be just the right book, the right fact, that great article, the best movie, or the audiobook to entertain the whole family on a long drive. The concept of intellectual freedom involves protecting the rights of all individuals to pursue the types of information they want and to read anything that interests them. Do not wait until you are faced with a challenge to devise a strategy. Make it part of your policy. Building a collection involves a studied approach to the selection, maintenance, development, and evaluation of the library's materials. Collection development includes the building of collections in all formats needed by the community. A different process altogether, collection evaluation, is the continuous process of analyzing use, age, condition, timeliness, and coverage of library materials. The American Library Association has a long and valued tradition of supporting the public library philosophy of equal access to information. Documents such as the Library Bill of Rights, the Freedom to Read Statement, and the Freedom to View Statement, along with a well-thought-out collection development policy, should be part of your library's policy manual. A collection policy includes statements about how items are selected. It includes the topics, formats, and age groups served. Policies should include statements about the weeding process and the criteria applied to that process. Collection policies specify how a library handles donations, memorial books, and customer complaints. A collection policy determines participation in statewide programs such as open access and interlibrary loan. The policy indicates if the library will use local library databases, be part of consortial agreements, or house any special collections, such as local history or genealogy. A policy provides the rationale to inform the collection development functions and processes for the benefit of library staff members, library governing boards, and the user community. Your mission, goals, and objectives will help focus the library and its collections. The next few slides illustrate concepts from the Public Library Association book, Policies for Results. According to the authors, any policy should have 4 parts. The philosophy. This answers the why behind a program or service. It's written from the customer's point of view. The regulations. They will answer the what must be done to support the service or program. They are specific, written rules of the road that customers need to know. The procedures will answer the how. How will the staff carry out the service or program? These are also written, often step-by-step instructions detailing the staff's needs to perform. The guidelines will speak to best practice. Remember, the philosophy part of a policy answers the question why. It should include why a specific planned collection development is important, and it should relate back to community needs. The collection must remain relevant and useful to the people who are using it. While Ranganathan's rules can be applied to a broad spectrum of library resources, I think they kind of sum up the underlying philosophy about collection development. Remember, these rules have been updated by others to include the idea of library materials, not just books. His first rule, books are for use. This really speaks to the impact on collection development. I think it's very obvious. Libraries don't exist to simply collect or protect things. The second one, every reader his book, also speaks to the importance of collection development, and it helps us make sure that we are purchasing materials for all. We have something for everyone. Every book its reader. We want to make sure that we're purchasing materials that reflect our community's desires. Save the reader's time. This is a big part of cataloging. People need to be able to find things quickly and easily. And the last one, a library is a growing organism. This certainly includes the idea of adding to our collection as well as weeding materials. You can think of regulations like the red tape. They're the rules of the road that customers need to know. You'll want to include things like evaluation. It's important that patrons know we evaluate. We don't just buy everything and anything, and that we're unbiased as we purchase materials. I had a board member tell me one time that if he were the library would only have fishing books in it because that was what he enjoyed doing the most and what he liked to read about. But as librarians, we know that we want to make sure we have something for everyone. Your regulations should also talk about weeding. We have a whole separate course on that a little bit later down the road, but make sure that that's part of the regulations. The collection scope. Maybe your collection policy will state we do not purchase textbooks, or we will purchase everything in a series. You'll also want to think about format. What kinds of formats do you buy? In the early days of libraries, when videos were first coming out, there were many libraries who included in their collection development policy, we don't buy videos. We are only a place to get books. That's obviously changed today, but make sure you talk about the types of formats that you'd like to include and leave it open enough that you can add them as they come along. Also be sure to include something about reconsideration. How do you deal with those challenges from patrons? And of course, maintenance. We have to repair and replace, so make sure to include things like weeding and disposal. If you remember, procedures tell us how the staff is going to handle certain things. It can be a list of what to do first, second, and third. It's not always part of the policy. It's sometimes separated out in a procedures manual. We try not to change policies often, but procedures can change easily. When we're ready to order, how do we decide what to order? So your procedure section may include a list of criteria. How do we handle a box of books that a patron wants to donate? Donations should absolutely be part of your collection policy. Do you write an appraisal for someone who wants it for tax purposes? Hint, the answer is no. Also be sure to think about how do you get rid of things? Does it go in the garbage? Do we recycle? Do we have a book sale? Do we have online sales? The guidelines again speak to best practices, and this has customer service implications. It helps give direction to staff. The PLA book says this part isn't necessary for all policies, so you may not have it for your collection development policy. All libraries face complex challenges in identifying, acquiring, and managing appropriate information resources. Traditional formats and ever more technologically interesting information sources are expected by patrons in communities of all sizes. Small and rural public libraries have always faced unique challenges in this area. Some of those challenges include a limited budget for materials, licenses, and equipment, limited staff. Sometimes only one person performs all the library functions. Too many inappropriate and unsolicited gifts. You may also be limited in space for print material and limited computers for electronic access. And of course, there are always time constraints. In addition to these traditional issues, the changes in formats, market models, and technological tools have further exacerbated these challenges and are making collection development even more complex. Listed here are just a few of the balance issues collection development librarians must keep in mind. As Garcia and Nelson point out in the 2007 Public Library Service responses, if a library is making create young readers and emphasize service response, what implications will that have for collection development if we're emphasizing service to children 5 and younger? What are we going to stop buying in order to buy more than just the handful of board books we have now? Let's explore that issue of quality a bit more. It can, of course, be measured in a variety of subjective ways, including numbers. However, while size does matter, a larger collection is not necessarily a quality collection. Currency, turnover rates, and other statistical data can provide clues as to the quality of the collection as well. The central concept in the process of analyzing a collection is that collections are created, developed, and maintained to meet the needs of the community they serve. This means that the collection must remain relevant and useful to the people who are using it. Good collection development practices will start with an understanding of your community. You will also want to consider your library's strategic plan, including its mission. By involving the community as you engage in a planning process, you're finding ways in which the library can best meet the current needs of its potential users. You may also be evaluating your collections and gathering data in order to set goals. Public libraries of all sizes need to be guided by these documents to inform collection development activities. As the librarian in a small public library, you probably already base your selection decisions on what you know about your users' tastes and backgrounds. If you're involved in community activities and events, you will be somewhat familiar with your town's socioeconomic makeup. But it's unwise to think that you, your staff, or your board know all that there is to know about the community and the role the library can play in helping the community achieve its potential. By engaging in a planning process, a library discovers many things about the interests of individuals, the diversity of the community, and the number of programs, issues, and concerns previously unknown or unacknowledged by the librarian and/or board members. All of us tend to hang out with people who are much like ourselves, and this often blinds us to the needs and expectations of those who are less similar. In order to address some of those challenges we identified in balancing our collections, such as limited budget, limited staff time, and limited space, we need to set priorities. So we might ask some of the following questions. How is the user community changing? What's happening in the socioeconomic status, the demographics, employment trends, development plans? You will also want to ask yourself who uses the library and why. A more important question might be who does not use the library and why. What additional services or materials might better meet the needs of segments of the community? Are the physical facilities adequate for providing the types of services and materials needed by our citizens? What types of materials and information would best help the community as a whole reach the community vision? What are the community's expectations regarding the library for the future? The implications and the answers for this in building our collections are many. Now we're going to take a look at some of the elements of collection management, which can also be called the life cycle of a book. We've started with policy. That part's already done. Now we're going to launch into selection. We're going to start here and move through acquisition, cataloging, and processing, which is a large piece, so that actually has its own module. We'll be very brief here and then have more later. We're going to look at shelving and use, collection maintenance and repair, weeding, and ultimately discarding also has its own separate module. But how do you determine which books to buy or which types of collections to maintain? You'll want to go back to those community interests, look at the things people are requesting. You'll also need to take into consideration policy and budgets. You'll want to look at professional reviews and journals. You'll for sure want to be doing a regular review of your collection. We want to make sure we are not purchasing with bias and our personal preferences. A librarian must always give first consideration to the objectives and policies of the institution. A librarian also must strive to obtain the maximum value for each dollar of expenditure. A librarian would grant all competing vendors equal consideration insofar as the established policies of the library permits. And a librarian will always decline personal gifts and gratuities. According to OCLC's study, Perceptions of Libraries and Information Resources, the American public still looks to the library for books. It is important, therefore, to get what the readers want. We have to do so to stay relevant. That's what selection is. But again, we need to answer a few questions before we actually begin the selection process. We're going to go back where we started with this module. Make sure these kinds of details are spelled out in your collection development policy in order to prevent a lot of frustration and confusion on your part, the part of your staff, and on the part of the public. Our first question is who? Who is responsible for building your library's collection? Usually the director handles selection duties. But selecting books and other materials for the library can be a shared task among the staff. The library's collection development policy should designate who is responsible for selection responsibilities. In smaller libraries, the director usually selects adult materials, while the children's librarian selects materials for children and teens. The selection responsibilities may be further subdivided by format, including books and electronic formats such as DVDs, CDs, or downloadable materials. What goes into your collection? Do you have books, magazines, newspapers, movies, music, electronic resources, cake pans, puzzles, toys, costumes? Where? Where are you going to buy your materials from? We'll talk about where you acquire materials in the next few slides. And how? How are the items determined for suitability in the collection? We'll look at some of the tools you can use in the second module of collection management, maintaining your collection. But for now, you can use things like publishers' catalogs, pre-publication reviews like Booklist, Library Journal, School Library Journal, Publishers Weekly, or vendors like Baker and Taylor or Ingram. They provide new publication reviews. You can also find those in newspapers, on blogs, and lists from other libraries or annual best books, bookstore newsletters, books in the news. You want to look at your reader requests. You want to look at purchase requests. Keep track of all of those requests, especially by subject. Another source for selecting materials is customer recommendations. This can help ensure that the library is meeting the demands of its customers. However, you should not feel obligated to purchase everything that's requested. Items selected this way should fit in with the mission and selection policy of the library. When? Do you have a timeline for purchase and cataloging? How long does it take a bestseller to get on your shelf? Do you buy a book when only one person asks for it, or do you need to have a request from more than one? And finally, why? This goes back to your philosophy. Why is it important to add this to your collection? I found this next quote in a blog post online regarding selecting books in a connected world. Relying on traditional book review sources does not cut it for us anymore. It has never been a totally successful way to identify the books that the readers in our libraries want and need. Now that they're on the internet and watching cable television, it is less than adequate. We cannot limit ourselves to reading journals and looking at publishers' catalogs. Now that our readers surf the web, listen to talk radio, and watch book programs on C-SPAN, they're requesting books that they would not have even known about in the past. Their recreational interests are expanding too. The blog goes on to say, as a book selector for a medium small public library, not having the budget to buy indiscriminately, I need to identify the books with a buzz. I need to notice the books that our readers will notice, and I want to do it before they do if possible. One more thing to think about in regards to selection. While many people think they are giving you this, in actuality, it's closer to this. Remember, nothing is free. You can just say no to unsolicited, inappropriate, and costly gifts. You will need to do some type of processing and cataloging. So while the item might be free, adding it to your collection is not. You'll want to think about condition, appropriate formats, age, and the entire collection. Donations can be used to add extra copies of popular materials or to replace titles that are worn or out of print. Donated items should not be used as the primary source of new titles added to the collection unless donations are specifically purchased at the request of the library. When someone donates a bestseller from several years ago, most of your patrons wanted it when it was new, not 2 years later. You will also want to be aware of special requests, like what you can do with them after. Sometimes they will tell you things like you can't break up this set, or it's a personal collection that you have to give back when it's done. There are lots of things to consider. Is it a local author? Does it belong with local history? Are you going to collect memorabilia or newspapers, yearbooks? Donations can be very good for book sales. Then you can use the money to buy something that is better suited to your collection. After selecting and evaluating, we move into the acquire or purchasing stage. Once you select an item, it must be purchased. You should assign a percentage of the library's operating budget for purchase of library materials. There are many sources of library materials. Since cost is a major factor, it's usually best if you or selectors on your staff purchase from major book vendors that offer substantial discounts to libraries. If you use standard library vendors like Baker and Taylor or Ingram, discounts can be as much as 35 to 45%. Those prices are hard to beat at local bookstores or even Amazon. These vendors will often provide cataloging records and partial or complete processing for an extra cost. Libraries sometimes use donated materials to supplement their collections. This is okay to a certain extent, but it is really important for you and your staff to have control over the titles that are added to the collection. This chart seems like a very complicated process for purchasing books. I suspect this process that I found is for large libraries with many departments. Although acquisition procedures may vary depending on the library's mission and resources, all libraries have some goals in common. These include acquiring materials as quickly and economically as possible and minimizing the amount of paperwork, filing, and follow-up needed. We're going to focus on just a couple of all of these acquisition steps. We'll look at choosing a vendor, placing your order, bookkeeping, and processing materials. First, we'll look at choosing your vendor and actually placing an order. The first choice for most items, especially trade books and routine types of library materials, should be the primary vendor used by your library. Such a vendor is likely to be Baker and Taylor or Ingram. If the regular vendor isn't an option for a particular item, then the next likely choice is probably an online or an in-town bookstore. The online bookstore might be Amazon, Barnes& Noble, or some other source which will allow a library to establish an account or use a credit card. If an item is needed immediately, then a local bookstore, if there is one, or the online source may be the quickest way to get a particular title or additional copies of a very popular book. Setting up an account with a local bookstore is good business, and there are times when this is the most efficient way to acquire something that the library needs now. The ultimate decision regarding the source for each item depends on a number of variables that each must be weighed. So here are some of the factors to consider when selecting a primary vendor. Speed. You want someone who can deliver at least 75% of most of your orders within 2 weeks of the order date. Cost. Be sure to look at both hidden and upfront costs, and especially the discount that you're going to get. The cost of shipping is another factor to take into consideration. Also think about the ease of the ordering process. How do they handle back orders? What kind of paperwork do you have to do? Certainly you'll want to consider financial implications. How easy is it to get invoices? Do they accept electronic payments? Do they accept credit cards? Also, be sure to investigate their reliability. You want them to be accurate with the materials they send you, and you want to make sure they're available for you to get them when you need them. You'll also want to make sure that a vendor has an online database. It should contain historical as well as current records. You want to be able to track your orders, your online and the title status, and your order history. You'll also want to make sure that it allows staff members to mark records for ordering. And think about placing orders only when batch orders are approved by a person of authority. Vendors should provide good order tracking, flexibility, collection development aids like a website, newsletter, lists, reviews, pre-publication information. Vendors also ought to handle a variety of formats and take a look at their return policy. We'll spend just a few minutes talking about all the bookkeeping that you need to do in order to keep track of your materials, the invoicing, and the payment. If you have an automated system, this step can be made much easier, although a simple spreadsheet can also help you keep track. The first thing you want to do is send that order to your vendor. At this point, it can go into your catalog as on order. It doesn't say that the material is here, but it does allow patrons to place a request on that title before it gets in your library. The next step is those books arrive and the box is opened, and you want to check it off against a packing slip that's usually included. When the materials arrive, you want to make sure to compare them to what's ordered and inspect them for any obvious damage. Your vendor should clearly indicate on that packing slip what, if any, of the items are on back order or out of stock and when delivery is expected. Out of print or unavailable items should also be indicated. At this point, many libraries will put the price and where they purchased into the book, which ultimately goes into your cataloging record. The next step after those books have arrived and been opened and checked off against the slip is getting the invoice. You'll want to double check that packing slip and compare it to the invoice to make sure that you're only paying for what you actually received. Typically at this point, once that invoice arrives, you're going to need to code it. Where does that money come from? Most libraries have at least a book or materials line. Many libraries have it broken down farther than that. It may be a line for print materials. There may be a line for databases. There may be a line for children's materials or a line for audiovisual materials. Those can all be coded separately so you know how much money is coming out of your budget each month for all those particular collections. The next step is going to be different for everyone. You're going to pay the invoice, but it's going to be according to your city procedures. Typically, the librarian will get the invoice approved at the board meeting and take it to the city clerk for the processing of the next check. Next up, we're going to talk about processing and cataloging those materials. Most of what we think of as collection development obviously has much to do with technical services operations. In the model that we're using, cataloging and processing are part of the acquisition phase of collection management. We'll be going into this in much more depth in a separate module. Cataloging and to some degree processing is all about access. Patrons need to be able to find a book in your catalog and on your shelves. This collection development goal helps us think about the comment, oh, but this is the way it's always been done. We also want to think about are we doing things that are easiest for staff, or are we doing things in what's best for our patrons? Below is a list of possible areas to consider when examining the ways in which procedures can influence the ultimate results, no matter how good the collection development itself is done. Think about things like who decides where and how each item will be purchased? What factors are used to determine where to buy those things selected for purchase? Is it a vendor, a local bookstore, an internet source? And how do those decisions affect our ability to meet our patrons' needs? Are we going with the easiest, the fastest, the cheapest, the most reliable, or other considerations? In what order are things processed once they arrive, and why? In other words, is it for the ease of staff or for the meeting of patron needs? What's the key factor? Do you catalog by what comes in first goes out first? Do you catalog by what comes in last goes first out? Do you do the easiest things first and save the problems for later? Do you rank things that are used by a certain selector at the time of the order? Maybe you think this material is going to be a high priority or a rush. Maybe this one is a low priority. And again, that can be done at the time of ordering. You may also have a standard set of priorities, such as anything comes first if it's got a hold. Then we'll do all the adult fiction, and then nonfiction bestsellers, then other materials, then children's, then media. That set of priorities can also help if we're not doing a simple, when it gets here, it gets cataloged and back out. You will also need to think about where do projects fit into the workflow? Sometimes we have to go back and change things that are already in the collection. Maybe the Dewey numbers are spread out all over and we want to put them all together in the same place. Sometimes we have to do weeding and withdrawing items. You have to take time out of your day to pull those items from the catalog. Does that come before you catalog and put more items in? Where do mending and repairs fit into your workflow? And how do they influence the total processing work? You'll also want to think about under what circumstances do you correct or change a bibliographic record when it's downloaded from somewhere else? Think about considering the cost benefit of using reinforced materials and papers and covers for paperback books. Is the expected life of all paperback books worth reinforcing everyone, or is selectivity an option? Remember, library collections are disposable. How long does that paperback need to last? How do you decide what goes on the spine label and where the spine label goes? What are the reasons for the current choices? Again, is it patron access and ease of use, or is it staff preference for the deciding factor? Are decisions made with the idea of protecting things rather than using them up? What makes sense in today's highly changeable world? This brings us back to the idea of disposable materials. Another question to think about: who decides what things to borrow through interlibrary loan and what things to buy for the patron who made the request? When does buying a new or a used copy make more sense in terms of service and economics than borrowing it? If you think about it, all items borrowed from the library are used anyway in the end. How much labor goes into an interlibrary loan at both ends of the transaction? What do you have to show for it after it's done? Somebody requests a $4.99 paperback. Does it make sense to borrow it from another library, or does it make more sense to just buy it yourself and have it for the future? How can your collection development policies and selection criteria be used to determine what to borrow and what to buy? And the last question I want you to think about: who decides the best collection in which to place an item? You may have a circulating collection, a reference collection, a special collection, your easy books or your picture books, juvenile nonfiction, young adult, adult fiction. Who makes that decision? The person who chose the book? The cataloger? Is there a set of guidelines that make that decision easy? And then how much trouble is it to change an item from one collection to another? We'll be talking more about access in the cataloging module, but the whole point of having a collection is this part of the cycle: use. What do we do to materials to make them more accessible? After cataloging, we look at processing and labels. Some libraries use genre labels like mystery, science fiction, or romance. Sometimes those collections are shelved together in a separate part of the library. Readers advisory librarians also put together guides or pathfinders to help patrons find items they might like. Or a library might make a special display to highlight certain materials. All those things help ensure materials get used. Then, of course, they have to be reshelved. Collection management doesn't end once the item is on the shelf. The library collection needs to be maintained to ensure that it's meeting your customers' needs. The collection manager should evaluate the collection on a regular basis and add or remove items as necessary. There are 4 pieces to maintenance. Weeding. This is one of the most important parts of maintaining your collection. Weeding keeps a collection current, attractive, and makes way for new material, and provides ongoing evaluation of the library's material and its use. During the weeding process, the collection manager determines whether an item should be kept or removed. There are several questions to consider when making weeding decisions, such as, is the item up to date? When was the last checkout? What was the physical condition? Is there enough shelf space? Are there multiple copies? Is it duplicated by other books on the same topic? Is the item available elsewhere? Are new editions available? Is the item appropriate to the collection? Does the item have local significance? One excellent source of help with collection management is the CREW manual. CREW stands for Continuous Review, Evaluation, and Weeding. It details sound criteria behind weeding decisions. Repair. Think about staff time and the limited shelf life of materials. Preservation. This one can trip people up. Remember, we aren't preserving things, the popular materials that we have in our libraries. They don't need to be kept for the next 100 years, but you may have historical items. So we want to, again, reinforce some of those materials to make sure they last their life cycle, but think about staff time. Preservation and conservation refer to the processes of monitoring the physical condition of the library's materials and taking action to prevent further deterioration. Ironically, books published since the beginning of the 20th century are more likely to decay than the older books due to the paper and methods of binding used. Other modern materials, such as microfilm, photographs, videotape, and films, have unique preservation needs. When possible, it's a good idea to buy the best quality materials available, especially if the item is going to be one of those few things the library will wish to keep for a very long period of time. Permanence. Today, the vast majority of items in a public library are disposable. Under a tight budget, some compromises will have to be made, but if you anticipate high use or lots of potential damage, it may be better to spend a little more on the purchase, since repair or replacement costs might be avoided. However, in today's fast-moving information and publishing environment, permanency is the exception for most of the public library collection. Even university libraries often prefer to purchase paperback edition of books that are likely to have a short lifespan, and then are going to be sitting on the shelf for years without being touched. It is sometimes difficult to determine exactly what materials will need extra attention at the outset. Given the labor costs within the library, it is important to reinforce or in other ways give extra attention only to materials that are truly in need of such attention. Reinforcing the bindings on all paper-bound books might not be necessary, but determining which ones will need that extra work is a judgment call. The vast majority of the stock of our public and school libraries is quite disposable. There's no sense preserving things whose shelf life is limited to a few years. So we started with the policy. We ran through selection, purchasing, processing, cataloging, checkout and use, maintenance, repair, weeding, and ended with disposal. This is the life cycle of a book. This concludes the first collection management module, Building Your Collection, of the Director Endorsement course, Collection Management. Don't forget, you can always call your district consultant for more information about this topic. And thanks for watching.